Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
I'm delighted to be speaking with two people I really admire. One is Geshe Tenzin Namdak, who's a teacher and friend. He's a former environmental scientist who was ordained by the Dalai Lama as a Tibetan Buddhist monk in 1997. And for 20 years, Geshe Namdak undertook the rigorous Geshe Studies program at Sarah J. Monastic University. And today he's resident teacher at Jamyang Buddhist Center in London and a part-time tutor at Oxford University. His recent book, Freedom Through Correct Knowing, which you kindly gave me a copy of, I think, explores the nature of mind and consciousness from both contemplative and analytical perspectives. Professor Thomas Metzinger, great pleasure for me to be speaking with you today as well. He's a philosopher and a cognitive scientist who's dedicated his career to understanding consciousness and the nature of self. He was a professor of theoretical philosophy at Johannes Gutenberg University and co-founder of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. He's the author of the groundbreaking books Being No One, The Ego Tunnel, and The Elephant and the Blind. Each of these has reshaped our understanding of consciousness and identity. Beyond his academic work, Dr. Metzinger brings his philosophical insights to real-world challenges, including serving on the European Commission's high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. So welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having me.
So we have quite an ambitious program tonight, dealing with the topics of secular spirituality, consciousness in the mind, and the concept of no self. So I want to get right into it and give you as much time as possible to dive into these great topics. We'll start out with secular spirituality. And we'll begin that by asking what secular spirituality means to each of you and how you became interested in exploring this concept. We can start with Geshe, who is clearly not a secular spirituality individual. So what interests you in secular spirituality?
Yeah, as you can see, myself, I'm a Buddhist monk, but Buddhism in general, we don't have to study or practice to become a Buddhist, so to say. So in Buddhism, according to His Holiness Dalai Lama, we can have Buddhism in a kind of threefold kind of division, which makes it very clear. So one aspect is Buddhist mind science, or you could say Buddhist psychology, which has kind of a secular nature. The second one is Buddhist philosophy, which also has a secular nature. And then the third division is the Buddhist practice, right? So the Buddhist practice is more for those who are inclined to follow the Buddhist path, but the first two are of a secular nature. Yeah? So Buddhist mind science and its philosophy, you can study and practice if you're a believer or non-believer, so to say. And I think in many other forms of faith, there is a kind of great level of knowledge that can be used in order to present it in a secular way. And by doing so, presenting in a secular way, then you can benefit society at large, because not every person is maybe interested in becoming a spiritual person as such. So they can still study its minds and its division. What does it mean to have consciousness? What is subjective experience and things like that? Or what are the afflictions that disturbs our mind, and how to go about in eliminating and those disturbances and generating more constructive forms of thinking. And what is the philosophy behind it all? So that can be studied and practiced by believer or non-believer, so to say. So yeah, there are the secular aspects, you could say, within Buddhism.
Yeah. So Professor Metzinger, what does secular spirituality mean to you, and how did you become interested in it? Are you interested in it?
First of all, I want to apologize for having such a green face, but I'm just not getting it fixed here. I'm not from Mars. So I don't know if that is possible. For me, it's a project and an interesting question for a number of reasons. There is an open access paper flying around on the internet that's called Spirituality and Intellectual Honesty. And the idea is, can there be a form of spiritual practice or attitude that doesn't involve intellectual suicide or is kitsch or sticky or woo-woo, or cultivates delusion or irrationality? Is that at all possible? And I just think it's very interesting for all of us to think about this project of a secular spirituality. I do not know if it is possible. For instance, to get right into it, it might be that a sustained regular practice, I'm a regular practitioner for 48 years, that it needs a delusional core for its motivation. That's not entirely clear to me, so I'm very open to learning from you tonight.
What do you think? You want to respond to that,
Yeah.
Geshe? Can you be spiritual without being kitschy and delusional?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, generally speaking, what we present in the Buddhist kind of tradition of mind science and philosophy, it's kind of, we're very open to reasoning and even to empirical science, and we even go to the extent that if empirical science proves something that is opposing our scriptures, we can go along with the science. Yeah. So in that regard, it's very open and very secular in that way, and we don't really follow a kind of blind faith, so to say. We're just interested in what is the mind, what is consciousness, and what is reality. So in that regard, we try to learn from other forms of philosophy as well as from science. So in that way, I think it's quite reason-based and quite skeptical. Even our own positions we have to question. So in that way, I think it's quite an open kind of attitude towards the secular approach.
I can think of a number of examples where, say, modern science has contradicted scriptures. What are examples that come to your mind where you've seen contradictions and where you have changed your mind?
Yeah, I mean, contradictions from the point of view, I think from the point of view of mind science and philosophy, even within our schools of Buddhist philosophy, you have different interpretations, right? So that's you find everywhere. You find it in different sciences as well. But when it comes to a particular kind of philosophy, and then we can see that philosophy is in accordance with a particular modern scientific finding, although other maybe findings might, or other kind of philosophies within science might not really follow that. But still, like, for example, if you look in quantum mechanics and you look in the relational theory of Calaravelli, that very much aligns with the philosophy of Arya Nagarjuna, for example.
See this book?
But it doesn't.
This is the book on my table right now.
Yeah. So
I've read that one too. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we also did a dialogue, and we very much agree about certain aspects of reality lining up. Then when we had a dialogue with Anil Seth, for example, about consciousness and the brain, and then Anil Seth is, as you know, a little bit more materialistic kind of view holder of neuroscience. So in that regard, we have differences. But that I don't think we have really a proof of aspects of that consciousness is something completely different than the physical brain, or that it's an emergent property of the brain. That's pretty clear. But we haven't really found kind of evidence of that maybe consciousness is something more than just an emergent property of the brain. Yeah. So as David Charms is challenging that we might need to see consciousness as kind of a fundamental building block like space, time, and matter to examine that in more detail. So of course, I said, but within our scriptures, we have kind of aspects that are differences there, and in science we see the same thing. But up till now, I've seen quite a common ground in science as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So maybe take an easy example, dependent origination. There's one way to look at it was saying that was really, I think in English you say prescient, to understand the principle of causality that early in human history. And it may look that this is completely compatible with the scientific worldview, causal relations, and that it is almost a miracle that people would come up with this more than 20 centuries ago. But then again, it seems to me, I'm not a philosopher of physics, but that if you look at the quantum level, there is spontaneous origination there. The principle of causality does not hold everywhere, right? And I'm also not a Buddhist scholar like you are, but from my lay reading, it seems to me that, say, if nirvana or even pure awareness is something completely unconditioned and uncaused, how would one get there? How would one even have, the problem, of course, how would one even have knowledge of something that is itself uncaused? Christian theologians also know this problem. So for me, it's always a double image. It looks like very, very compatible with modern science, but then if you look closely, you find exceptions. Are you aware of these problems? Do they bother you at all? Or
I mean, to bother me is another topic, not that easily, but in general, I think things arise spontaneous without causes and conditions we don't really accept. But we have to see that, what does that mean, arise spontaneous without causes and conditions? Because if you look, for example, in many aspects of quantum mechanics, what Einstein looked at as the spooky events, so to say, that David Bohm and others, they come to an interpretation of that, of the hidden variables. And in Buddhism also, we have levels of reality that we can classify certain types of information, of either of consciousness or information of matter in that regard, that falls in this same kind of category of what David Bohm calls the hidden variables, right? So in that regard, I don't think there's a real contradiction from the point of view of a particular philosophy we call the Prasangika school of Buddhist philosophy.
Just one school, right?
Yeah, there is one school, yeah.
So we have many schools in 25 centuries of Buddhist thought, and we have many schools in Western thought. And now, what does it mean to be intellectually honest? To return to that question of secular spirituality. Is that at all possible? To have a spiritual practice without belief system, without being attached to a tradition, without being member of any school? Or is this actually just another fancy illusion?
I don't think it's a fancy illusion. I think it's definitely possible if you just get the knowledge of the mind itself, for example. What is the mind? What are the disturbances of mind? And you can study that. And what are the antidotes, so to say? You can study that within Buddhism or with other forms of thought, or even in science for that matter. And then you just take out the things that you find beneficial, right? So in that regard, you don't really have to follow a particular tradition. You just use the information or the knowledge that is being presented. So that, I think, that could be quite seen as a secular approach.
It looks to me, as you are probably aware, I'm a pretty radical guy, and I don't like it if I sit in a silent retreat and the warm-hearted, wonderful meditation teacher in front raises his index finger and says, "The Buddha said." As an academic philosopher, you know all this much better than me. I mean, it's not clear what language the historical Buddha spoke. The first written records are more than 300 years, if there was a single historical Buddha. So for people to claim that they know what the Buddha said, that's, from my perspective, incredibly naive. And it's not secular or honest spirituality. But for a little radical guy like me, what remains actually, and what traditions are necessary for, is techniques. So what we have
Exactly.
is meditation techniques. And what the radical individual can do, if they are serious, is test them out in their own lives and see what that does, and if there's any value in it. That is something everybody can do, and of course, many people don't.
Yeah, I mean, same as what you as a radical guy are. I was the same when I just started with Buddhist path. And what struck me a lot in the beginning, as I also have a scientific background in hydrology, is that in the Buddhist teaching, especially in the tradition we follow of great Nalanda Monist University, the philosophy behind it, then there's a lot of emphasis on research and checking things out. And there were even quotes that the Buddha said, "Don't believe what I've said," out of reference or respect for me, but analyze, like you analyze a piece of gold and see if it's pure or not. So in a similar way, you should use this kind of reasoning and not just scriptural reference. So in our tradition, there's a lot of emphasis on epistemology and reasoning to actually analyze if it's really true what's been said in the scriptures.
Yeah, the question, of course, is if there's anything like epistemic authority in cases of conflict. For instance, say science tells me in all likelihood conscious experience is a brain-bound phenomenon, is impermanent like everything else. And then say on a cushion, my meditation experience tells me something else, and says there's something which is very hard to speak about, but it might not be brain-bound. And then somebody else comes and says, yeah, that's why you meditate. Mortality denial, that's your driving motive, and that's why you interpret your experience like that. Who is actually right? Do you have any view on this? Can people, say, on the basis of their own practice, make claims of knowledge that cannot be criticized by rational argument and which cannot be refuted, say, by empirical experiments? Is anything like that possible?
I think you should be able to do that. I mean, we very much put a lot of emphasis in checking your personal experience, so to say, with authentic scriptures and reasoning. You constantly have to. There shouldn't be a difference between what you study and what you experience, right? So in that regard, you should be able to check things. What you experience, is that kind of a genuine experience or not? That's very important in the practice. And if it's a general experience or not, we can even relate it with the findings within the findings of emotions, or if you want to train your mind, for example, and you want to eliminate disturbance of mind or disturbing emotions, then you have to understand how do they come up, how do they abide, how do they disintegrate, and what are the antidotes, and does it really work the way the method is being given. And then you analyze and you put it into practice, and then you check if you did it the right way, in the sense that it produces the effect that it should produce. So there's a constant kind of, the meditation itself is constant self-reflective in the sense to see and check if it's done in the right way.
Yeah, I understand what you mean, but the question is if there's a possibility for what in the elephant book I've called theory contamination, that because you have a certain belief system, certain experiences happen or do not happen, or if there are possibilities in the human mind of the practitioner for unnoticed self-deception. So I'll tell you a little, just to make this concrete and so-called personal. When I began to practice seriously as a young man, I briefly looked into Tibetan Buddhism and immediately discarded it as shamanistic, the visualizations and all that, lots of irrelevant gaga nonsense. And some 45 years later, I'm reading the Ocean by the 16th Karmapa. What's in English, the Ocean of True Meaning or Infinite Meaning?
Could be, yeah.
Yeah. And I find a motive which you will probably know very well, which reappears in Tibetan Buddhism, which says silence, non-conceptuality, non-thought, clarity, and bliss. That's not it. These are meditation moods. I said, what? Moods? So, and I go by my own experience for 4 decades. Bliss is one thing maybe, but clarity and non-thought seems to be absolutely self-evident as right. Now here comes this guy from the 16th century who says, no. You get fettered by this. This is not it. It is the union of lucidity and emptiness. And don't get attached to non-thought and clarity. Then I think, what does this guy mean? Try to find this in my experience. And actually, I do not have anything to check in my experience except words. Words from many centuries ago and words from many other Tibetan scriptures, which of course I now have. And how do I find out? If my experience says absolute silence and clarity, maybe with bliss, this is it. Somebody comes along and says, what does one do then?
Yeah, don't put on the finger. Yeah, the Buddha said, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it depends what you want to accomplish with your meditation. That's also very important to know. If the purpose of your meditation is just to relax and experience some advanced levels of consciousness you call bliss or clarity, then that's fine. Right. We even have meditation techniques to enhance that aspect, right? So concentration meditation, for example. But there are also advanced levels of meditation that you use that clarity and bliss to understand reality in order to eliminate what we call ignorance. So if that's the purpose of your meditation, then the clarity by itself or the non-thought by itself is not really the purpose, because then the purpose is to eliminate ignorance. And for that aspect, to eliminate ignorance, you have to understand ultimate reality, what we call emptiness. So then you join this clarity of the mind with emptiness, and becomes this union of the two. So then you have different meditation techniques that has different results, and that's not that that you choose what you like to accomplish with your meditation, and particularly in a secular way, right? So then, but what you read in that book is from the point of view of wanting to eliminate ignorance, and for that purpose you have to join it with emptiness, right? But if your purpose of meditation is to get more experience of consciousness itself, to examine what consciousness is, and to get some personal first-hand experience of the clarity of the mind, for example, to get that knowledge as means to develop, then that's fine. Then you don't have to join it with emptiness, right? But you just have to know that there are different techniques for different purposes, and the different techniques, they produce different results. Yeah.
And they, of course, every technique produces a different meditator, a little entity that's directed as a goal. The goal may be, say, to be a better human being and to be more compassionate in this world. The goal may be to be a more efficient financial criminal or something like this. Is there meditation without a technique and without a meditator?
That might be different, because conventionally we exist, right? So conventionally there is a person, and
you just didn't.
Zoom did, but yeah. So that means that when we say there's no meditator, for example, that means there's no, from its own side, existing meditator without any dependence as such. And then we say there's no meditator, right? But on a conventional level, we have consciousness, we have a body, and we active in our thoughts and meditation in that regard. And meditation itself is just an habituation pattern we build up in our stream of consciousness. As you said, it could be just analyzing things and come to conclusions. So it could be a positive thing or it could be a negative thing, right? So what we try to accomplish in meditation, in Tibetan we say the word gom means actually to habituate your mind to a positive pattern. Yeah, that's just building up an habituation, and that will change you, and that will change your behavior and will change your way of thinking.
Yeah, but isn't there also a perspective where this is just the old entity perpetuating itself on subtler levels, and that everything is already done and just needs to be recognized, and that actually you will never be liberated, but there is something that already is, but that in a certain sense has nothing to do with you sitting on a cushion, pursuing a goal with multiple techniques, reading books. What is the relationship between these, in your view, say these approaches, which one might say are constructive and still agentive? I use different meditation techniques, and the idea of just recognizing.
Yeah, so what I said before, there are different meditation techniques which produce different kind of results, right? So, and it also depends on the individual, what the person wants to accomplish. You know, that's very much an aspect as well. If you said before, if you just use these techniques as a secular way to change your mind and get more peace of mind and be able to reduce stress and anxiety and fear, then there are techniques to do that. But if you want to go a step further and try to eliminate more kind of deeper levels of stains of consciousness, so to say, or the disturbing emotions, then there are also techniques. And to refer to your beginning of your question, is that it's not that we already enlightened or we already liberated. We have kind of, in Buddhism, we have kind of two types of Buddha potential, as we say. One is the ultimate nature of our mind, which is just a property of consciousness, you could say, an ultimate nature of consciousness or a property that we already have. But we also have to develop it. And for that purpose, we need to do work, right? And that ultimate nature of our mind is there, but if you never recognize it, then you cannot really use it. So then we try to, with this developing aspect, we try to recognize it, and then we go a step further in the direction of liberation, so to say.
So for Thomas the practitioner, what you're saying is absolutely obvious. For Thomas the philosopher, the question is, if somebody doesn't believe this, this guy's making knowledge claims, I'm too lazy to meditate. This guy, these people, these traditions say there is an ultimate nature of mind. At the same time, they like to pose as anti-essentialists, you know. It's a bit weird why should I believe that there's an ultimate nature of mind? Because just because some people who have created altered states of consciousness in themselves say so. That would be the typical critical philosopher's approach. That's what my colleagues would say. Can this be shown by argument? Can it be shown in the brain? Doesn't look like it, right?
Can it be shown by argument? It does look like it's possible.
Aha.
Yeah. First of all, yeah, because when we have to all clearly understand that what do we mean by the ultimate nature of consciousness, right? That's very important to understand, not just a vague kind of description and keep it vague, and no, not at all. What we call the ultimate nature of consciousness means that consciousness does not inherent exist in and by itself. It's in the nature of cause and effect relationships, and it's in the nature of moments, of parts and a collection of parts, and it's in the nature of being merely imputed by the mind. If you look in those three levels of dependent origination, of cause and effect relationships, parts and a collection of parts, and being merely imputed by the mind, eventually, if you look for consciousness within the past, present, and future, you cannot really find it as such. It's just eventually you come to the conclusion it's labeled by a particular period of moments of experience, and then you say, okay, this is what I call consciousness. So this kind of ultimate reality of consciousness, that it's lacking its inherent or intrinsic aspect, That's very much aligned with what we even see in science. If how Carlo Rovelli, for example, describes a chair or consciousness for that regard, he also comes to the conclusion it's not findable. It's kind of a label. So from that point of view, I think we very much align with, if you want to put the philosophy of relational quantum mechanics, then I think this philosophy is very, very much aligned with that argumental and based on empirical evidence, as Carlo Rovelli uses to put forward his kind of theory, right? So then you have the argumental aspect, and I think as well as the empirical underlying kind of research that actually proves what actually is this ultimate reality then, what actually do we perceive and what's out there.
Well, you may know that 3 years ago, I have founded something that's called the MPE project, where we try a minimal model explanation for consciousness as a theory of science background. And you know from the book that I have asked practitioners in 57 countries and different traditions how they would describe the experience of pure awareness. What you may not know is that last week we have given away the Computational Phenomenology of Pure Awareness Prize, 20,000 euros for the first time. The young man who won it is just in the Lumbini in the temple in Kathmandu. So you can find on the internet very hard to understand computational mathematical models of how information could flow. We're tying, in the cooperation between philosophy and neuroscience and mathematical models, we're trying to take this to the next level, to a much higher level of precision with mathematics, not with natural language. And there were people in the jury. You have met Anu Seth, I understood, was one jury member. Some other very famous people like Carl Friston, for instance. So imagine we had something like this, a mathematical model of what some people may call the ultimate nature of awareness itself, or self-knowing, pure awareness, or something like that. Do you think it would be possible to implement this in non-living systems, like in machines, in AI systems of the future?
If consciousness of AI systems can possess consciousness, you mean?
No, if they can possess the ultimate nature of mind.
Yeah. So first of all, AI, whatever AI, equipment you have or software you have, that by itself is empty of inherent existence, right? So that ultimate nature is true for every object we know, or every object that exists, right? So there's one aspect. So that means the property of every object is that it's empty of inherent existence. That's true for the computer, that's true for our bodies, true for our mind, that's true for every object. Yeah. But the other question, if AI has consciousness and that consciousness is empty of inherent existence, then wherever consciousness is empty of inherent existence. That's one thing. So the only question remains is, can AI possess consciousness, right? So then the answer will be, if there's a cause and effect relationship that makes it possible for AI to possess consciousness, then that's possible, right? But if it can sustain consciousness or not, that's still a question. It's been in Buddhist...
Of course.
Yeah. In the Buddhist philosophy, we talk about various species of beings, not just humans, but as you know, also animals. It's quite clear that's been proven that animals possess consciousness, right? But the gray zone of more primitive kind of forms of species, if they have consciousness or not, that's still like kind of a gray zone, even within Buddhist philosophy, right? And then the main limit we put to it is if that consciousness is striving for happiness and not wanting suffering, then we could kind of more or less indicate that there's an aspect of consciousness that could be present, if those two factors are there, of striving for happiness and try to eliminate or try to use for methods to eliminate suffering, because there's a subjective aspect needed.
But if one looks at the frontier in consciousness science and in mathematical modeling of the brain, one clearly finds something like bhavatana, like the craving for existence in systems like that. And in a certain sense, this also shows that the essence of biological evolution is suffering, because it is a constant uphill battle against entropy. We are anti-entropic systems, and all the things I'm now loosely saying, they could of course be formulated terribly precisely and with a lot of math if we wanted to do this. But for me, it's very clear that the suffering nature of what we know on this planet, of biological evolution, becomes more evident right now than many Buddhists have ever thought, even. And it kind of pops out. And that is why this transition to post-biotic systems that may be neither natural nor artificial, maybe some strange mixture in the future, is a very critical one. Because for anybody, Buddhist or not, who subscribes to the alleviation of suffering as an ethical goal, there's a very high risk that we might multiply the suffering that already exists in a future kind of entity that it's just coming. On the other hand, there are these questions that sound like crazy questions, and really, for people who are not quite right in their minds, these questions of bodhisattva AI. Like, could biological evolution just have been a transitory phase to forms of mind which are free of suffering eventually? Could we be something like the ugly bootstrap phase to bodhisattva AI, or entities who are conscious but don't know suffering anymore? It's very hard to tackle the questions, but I think everybody who wants to minimize suffering must think about this AI revolution very careful, because there is a great potential for it to create much more suffering. And the risk does not come out of the technology itself. It comes out of the coupling of the human mind with its craving, with its greed, with its pride, all the things that are obvious to you, to this technology. And if you now see what tech billionaires are actually doing with that technology, making everybody addicted through social media, and so it actually looks that the technology will create much more suffering than liberation on this planet. And this is actually, for anybody who shares what I suppose are your ethical commitments, it's a major challenge, right? That's now there. Do you have any ideas how to deal with it?
I don't have the solution to all our problems in the world, I'm afraid, but this is the nature of reality as well. That world evolutions, they go to periods of less or more suffering. That's also a realistic aspect of reality. And we should look for means and methods to prevent the suffering from becoming more, as you just also indicate yourself. That's the people who actually train AI. That's the major issue, right? With the craving and attachment, as you mentioned yourself. So that's a very important issue. But when it comes to, that things are degenerating and there is more suffering, and the world will experience more suffering than it hasn't experienced before, as you indicated, that even in Buddhism, we talk about various world evolutions that these types of sufferings we have experienced, because this planet Earth is not the only one, right? So there's many world evolutions where similar forms of life and similar forms of suffering and similar forms of difficulties we are facing now. So from the Buddhist perspective, if you think since beginner's lifetime, these things have happened before. So it's not that it's completely new. The thing is, it's created by afflictions. Yeah, the problems are created by afflictions, either directly or indirectly. So then we talk about we have to do something about these afflictions, and that's kind of the underlying aspect of all problems in society is the mind itself, and that's very clear. That our behavior.
I could not agree more, but we know more. We know more, for instance, that we are now 8 billion people on the planet, and in 2083 we're going to probably peak at 11. And the very large majority is not interested in these questions at all, either because they think differently or because they really have other problems in their life than to even think about something like that. So it will always be a small minority that asks these questions or practices. And so can we not predict that the number of suffering individuals will increase, basically?
On this planet, yes. If you see the growth of the humans, for example, from the point of view of suffering of humans, that will increase. And you see also that the world doesn't seem to go in a particular good direction with the climate crisis and wars and difficulties with AI. You just put a few forward yourself. So that in general is something that seems to be happening, but we should try to look for means, and not only a few individuals, but we should try to have kind of platforms for discussing this on a higher level, and the level of governments. They should generate more interest in education of the mind, in educational systems, rather than just think about the economic growth, for example. It's very important to get more emphasis in the direction of the education of the mind. I think that's very crucial, and to start in the educational systems in the different countries to let people understand their minds better and to understand what actually are we looking for. Are we looking for economic growth, or are we looking for happiness? And how do we achieve those goals in life? And that's kind of something very, very fundamental questions we should ask on a government level, that we're looking for happiness, and that can only be accomplished by understanding our mind. So we need education of the mind, and whatever technique or whatever philosophy or whatever science you use, or a combination of it, even better. I think scientific based kind of practices and scientific based methods. I think that's the great need in the modern world.
Well,
Now
I think the two of
both-
us really converge on this for 200%. For the last 2 years, I've been working in a group of the German National Academy. It was labeled on self-regulation competencies in a little complicated way for children and youth. And you will see this in English very soon. We've made a very detailed proposal to the government that we have many idealistic and local projects where meditation is taught in schools in Germany, and more people do this. Parents demand it, but the proposal now is really to come top down and on a systematic level. I've learned many things from all these super smart experts in this research group. For example, what's something I wasn't aware of, that it's not clear, given development of the human brain from age 14 to 16 to 18, what meditation techniques would actually be good at what age. And there are very smart people who say we don't have the data. So there's a possibility that Vipassana, for instance, might only make sense at 17, 18. And that younger children would have to have forms of meditation in bodily movement, like Tai Chi or Qigong or yoga or something like this. And that we have to do much more research on what level in the education system will we do what. Now we have this proposal out, and the government ignores it, doesn't look at it. And 25 very very highly decorated experts have worked on this for 2 years. But there are, of course, all these movements everywhere that we have to get it into the education system. And something we also don't know is what actually the time windows are in the development of a human life, where there is the neuroplasticity, the flexibility. If there are times when it is too late for certain things, might be possible. You know, if you're, say, already seriously addicted to drugs or to success or things like that. I want to know something else from you. I want to go back to your early history and ecology. So I have written a book which you don't have yet, a small blue book, which is making waves in Germany. It's called Bewusstseinskultur. It's a culture of consciousness. You get a vague idea what this is about if you just read the epilogue of the Elephant book. No English publisher yet, but in the first chapter, I say we have to very first face the fact, if one looks at the numbers with the climate catastrophe, sober and mindfully, this is not looking good at all. You know, it looks as if humanity is facing open-eyed with its eyes. We know this for 4 decades now. For 30 years, every child knows about climate change, and emissions are rising all the time. And we don't get our act together. And I'm saying it's not only the inertia of the physical systems that make this very dangerous, but it's the inertia of the human mind and the inertia of the political institutions. And the question for people like us now is, how does one actually preserve one's dignity and one's self-respect in a historical period where very obviously humankind as a whole is just about to lose its dignity because it's failing in this ecological crisis? And I know you come from there, actually. How does, because that has to do with secular spirituality and a sane meditation practice too. How does the right kind of meditation practice help one to live in a historical epoch like this, where one sees this is probably going wrong, right? This probably, it will not work out. From an ecological perspective, you must have thought about this.
Yeah, I still do. Yeah, I mean, we have kind of one aspect is that, you know, we have a saying that if you have a problem and you can solve that problem, you should use whatever means that are needed to solve that problem. If you have a problem and you cannot solve it, then also, you know, you should be able to accept it the way it is, right? That's a very easy statement, but we try to do our best, you know, but sometimes people just don't listen, you know, and then you mentioned that just before with your own project with the German government is, you know, that we try, but sometimes things just don't work out, you know, and for that purpose also, then we have to not really let it by that, but try to look for other means to look if there's other angles we can do something about it, right? So we should strive to address the issue, but we should not really being mentally completely disturbed by it, because that also doesn't really help, you know. So I think we should have a very courageous attitude, and we try whatever methods that is possible. And if you walk against the wall, then we shouldn't give up, so to say. We shouldn't put it completely down and get mentally disturbed by it, because we understand different people have different opinions and different kind of decisions are made based on that. But we should just try to move on and keep trying. I think that's a very important, courageous attitude we like to aspire and like to follow. Yeah.
But I would think that this is where Buddhism really has something to offer. this quality of keeping on, but without hope, in a state of non-attachment, because this quality is what we will need. And of course, for many spiritual practitioners, their spiritual practice is actually a second spiritual Disneyland world kind of. They create some states, and like many of us, they also have psychedelic experiences to a certain degree, and then they interpret them in a certain way that is supposed to help them live. But now things are kind of closing in on us. And I think we need a special property. We need self-compassion in that situation, not only for others, but with ourselves. But we also need a certain quality of self-respect in the face of failure. And I would be very interested in learning from all of you how we can, well, fail gracefully or fail with dignity in this historical situation. Because I myself, I only manage this very rarely, and often I don't. And bitterness is very close. What has been successful for you in your own life?
I mean, what I think is with projects like this, if you have a very good motivation before you start with a project, and you keep that motivation alive for the benefit of humankind, or for the benefit of people on the planet, or for the benefit of education and in society, right? So then you have this pure motivation that you do it for the benefit of others. And then you engage in the project, and then it can happen that it completely collapses, or the government rejects it, as you see, right?
Yes.
But then you shouldn't give up in the sense of getting really down about it, because we know everything is dependent on causes and conditions. Nothing is perfect in our lives, and we tried our best, and that won't, as a Buddhist practitioner, but can also be done in a secular way. You could make a kind of wish or a kind of prayer to say, okay, I tried my best. I put so much effort and time into it. It didn't work out, but at least I created causes for it to work out in the future. That gives you a very positive, courageous attitude to move on and not to give up, so to say, rather than just think, oh, it didn't work, forget it all, right? So I think that kind of courageous attitude in looking towards a positive side in the future, that I created causes for this. It didn't work out now, but at least I created causes for it to be able to do that in the future. Yeah, and then it can give us some more courage, you know.
Yeah, I understand very well what you're saying, actually. The idea would be to be able to live in a way that one can say, it wouldn't have been my fault, right? But let go and be non-attached. The problem, of course, is, as every honest practitioner knows, that one's own motivation is not pure. So one should have a pure motivation, but if one really researches this and really is with it and looks at it, one's own motivation is not so pure. It's also, how do you say,
Mixed.
it's
often,
impermanent.
probably.
It's impermanent. It's fluctuating like everything else, right?
Yeah. So that's why we should try to use kind of awareness or mindfulness to recognize again and again, and make sure we generate the correct motivation every day before we start with our work, for example. It's just kind of building more awareness about the motivation of the things we're doing is very essential. And if you do that in that way, then in the end, there's no really regret, or then you keep your dignity alive, you know, because you know you're on the right track. And sometimes, of course, our motivation gets a bit mixed, but we try to make our you know, primordial or our kind of substantial or initial motivation as pure as possible, and try to reflect on it again and again. You know? I'm
gonna quote this. I like this way of putting it. Sometimes my motivation gets a bit mixed. That's a very nice and diplomatic way to put it. But that is part of the situation we find ourselves in, right? That's the human condition. And it, of course, also creates conflict. And the question that always comes up in many circles is, I hear this from many corners, yeah, but it's all right, but it doesn't scale. People start, they have the latest word I've heard from the German MBSR people is mindfulness snack offers. People just get these totally watered down apps and stuff as snacks now. And a recurrent experience of many meditation teachers also is people stop after 1.5 years. And human beings even stop, doctors know this too, taking a medication when they have clearly seen it helps and it's good for them. And doctors call this compliance, and then they just stop taking it. That is a practice, that's an experience I think many spiritual traditions have had. Do you have something to say about why there seems to be a small group that has this existential commitment and stays with it, and so many people who, go in, experience, see how good it is, and get lost again? What is that?
Because that how good it not is, the habituation patterns are just strong. We lacking the habituation patterns of really understanding just by having a mere experience. Oh, this really benefits me. That by itself is not enough. That needs to be stronger, and you have to build strength, and that only comes by habituation of it. So that in those cases, then what is lacking is the habituation to that positive pattern. And then the negative patterns, they take over, because those negative patterns are there from before we started with this practice or this medication whatsoever. And consciousness, as you know, even in neuroplasticity, it all has to do with habituational patterns. So consciousness is, as we talk about, or we're going to talk about in our next topic, I think, consciousness, is that it's a momentary thing. And one moment of consciousness produces the next. So whatever habituation is stronger, that harvest is the greatest, right? So what is then often lacking is how habituation patterns. We just have to put some effort in that direction. Otherwise, the negative patterns, they take over again.
Yeah. So I want to take a quick break here. Let everybody take a short break. And then we'll come back and talk about a little bit about consciousness, get into the specific definitions of consciousness. We use those words a lot, but I want to hear both of you define consciousness and mind, and then talk about the concept of gnosis.
I protest. I have to, after the break, quickly reply.
Oh yeah, sure. Of course.
Okay.
Go right ahead. But let's let everyone have a quick break.